Lucia Oliveira knew the sound of the alarm clock well before the sun even thought of rising. Her life, stitched with the threads of necessity and hope, was an endless rush in the suburbs of São Paulo, a constant effort so that nothing would be lacking for Sofia, her 4-year-old little one, the light that guided her tired steps. On that Tuesday morning, however, a knot of panic formed in her throat, cold and tight. The neighbor who looked after Sofia had woken up sick, and Lucia, who had just gotten a job as a cleaner in the penthouse of one of the richest and most reclusive men in the city, had no other choice. The fear of losing what seemed to be her only chance to get her bills in order was a bitter taste in her mouth as she dressed her daughter, pleading to the heavens for the little one to behave. Upon entering the private elevator that would take her to the top of the skyscraper, Lucia felt as if she were ascending to another world, an Olympus of cold marble and sepulchral silence. Mr. Ricardo Mendez's penthouse was not a home. It was a mausoleum, a palace of glass and steel that echoed the absence of life, where every designer object seemed untouchable and every polished surface reflected loneliness. She held Sofia's little hand with a force that betrayed her nervousness, whispering desperate orders for the girl to be quiet, not to touch anything. In her heart, a prayer repeated like a mantra. Please don't let him show up. Just for today, my God. Just for today. Every step inside that place was torture. The feeling of being an intruder, a piece out of place in that puzzle of luxury and emptiness. Ricardo Mendez materialized in the doorway of his office like a phantom in his own castle. He did not walk. He glided over the marble floor with a soundlessness that was, in itself, intimidating. Silence was his companion, his armor, the only luxury he truly demanded. 7 years. 7 years in which each morning was a copy of the one before, a routine of absolute control designed to keep the ghosts of the past locked in a titanium safe in his memory. Work was his anesthetic, numbers his religion, and solitude his self-imposed penance. In that instant, however, something desecrated his sanctuary. It was not a loud noise, but a whisper of life, the almost imperceptible shuffling of clumsy little feet, followed by a muffled giggle that sounded like shattering glass in his soul. A cold, calculated fury began to rise up his spine. It was the irritation of a surgeon whose sterile field has been contaminated. He left his refuge not to scream, but to extinguish that anomaly, to restore the silent and empty order he called peace. His eyes, grey as a storm-swept sky, swept the room and locked on Lucia, who froze on the spot, dread etched on every line of her face. But then his gaze lowered and found the source of the desecration. And it was there that Ricardo's world, built with such painful precision, stopped spinning. The source of that sound that had shattered his silence was a tiny thing, a girl of perhaps 4 years, with giant, curious eyes that held not a single spark of fear, and in her hands the most bizarre and disconcerting image he could conceive, a pair of absurdly large yellow rubber gloves which looked like the paws of a cartoon character. Lucia, paralyzed by terror, could barely breathe, her brain screaming for her to grab her daughter and hide her, but her body refused to obey. Before a word could be spoken, little Sofia took a step forward, holding up one of her gloved hands. Inside it, a treasure was offered, a broken piece of a cornstarch cookie. Ricardo's mouth went dry. The gesture, so simple, so pure and devoid of any self-interest, pierced through 7 years of ice and touched the wound he kept open. In that instant, he did not see the cleaner's daughter. He saw an echo of what never was, a ghost of a promise. The name Sofia, the same one he and his wife had chosen, exploded in his mind with the force of a grenade. The world around him dissolved into a blur, leaving only that small yellow hand offering the humblest of pieces, a truce his soul did not know it desperately needed. A crack, fine as a strand of hair, had just appeared on the frozen surface of his heart. Time seemed to stretch and twist in that instant, turning seconds into a torturous eternity for Lucia. Each beat of her heart was thunder in her ears, drowning out any other sound. She expected the scream, the order of expulsion, the summary dismissal that would throw her back into the abyss of uncertainty and despair. Ricardo Mendes's stillness was infinitely more frightening than any burst of anger. She saw his gaze fixed on Sophia, but she couldn't decipher that expression. It was a vacuum, an abyss of contained emotions that she had no ability to read. In her mind, catastrophic scenarios unfolded at high speed. She and Sophia being thrown onto the street, her name on the blacklist of employment agencies, the overdue rent becoming an eviction notice. It was the script of failure that every single mother fears, the proof that she was not capable of protecting her child, that her attempt to dream of a little stability was foolish. She held her breath, feeling the weight of the world on her shoulders, while her daughter, in her divine innocence, continued to hold the millionaire's gaze, the cookie still extended like a flag of peace on a silent battlefield. Inside, Ricardo was a city, collapsing. The crack in his heart widened, and through it, a flood of sensations he had violently dammed up began to leak. It was the sweet, buttery smell of the cornstarch cookie, a scent so absurdly simple and domestic that it contrasted brutally with the sterile air of his apartment. It was the memory of Helena, his wife, laughing as she chose a shade of yellow for the baby's room, a yellow as bright and happy as the gloves on that little stranger. The name, Sophia, echoed in his head, no longer as a thought, but as a physical presence, a vibration that ran through his body and disarmed his defenses one by one. His hand, which minutes before had been clenched in a fist of irritation, relaxed by his side. An involuntary spasm made it twitch slightly, as if wanting to reach for that gesture, but the paralysis of grief was still too strong. The icy fury that had driven him there had completely dissipated, leaving in its place a raw and terrifying vulnerability. He, the man who controlled a technology empire, was completely subdued by the power contained in a cookie offered by a child. Slowly, like an ice statue beginning to yield under an unexpected sun, Ricardo Mendes's arm moved. The gesture was almost imperceptible at first, a contraction of muscles that had not received such a human command in years. His hand, which usually closed on million-dollar contracts or gestured with cutting authority in boardrooms, now opened with a hesitation that bordered on reverence. For Lucia, who watched everything with wide eyes, that scene was more unreal than a dream. The tycoon, the fortress of a man, was bowing, not physically but in spirit, before her daughter. His long, pale fingers touched the yellow glove. He felt not just the rubbery material, but the slight warmth of Sophia's little hand underneath, a living heat that seemed to travel up his arm and lodge directly in his chest. With a care he did not remember possessing, he took the piece of cookie. And then, the 7-year silence was broken not by an order, but by a single word, hoarse and low, as if excavated from a deep and dusty place. "Thank you." The sound hung in the air, fragile and powerful, and Sophia just smiled, a wide, toothless grin, the most important mission of her day successfully accomplished. The word "thank you" echoed in the room and ricocheted inside Lucia's head, dismantling all her certainties and fears. The air she held in her lungs escaped in a silent rush, and for a moment, she felt her legs weaken. What was happening? That man whose coldness was legendary and whose gaze, moments before, promised annihilation, had just thanked her daughter for a piece of a cookie. The relief she expected to feel did not come. In its place, an even more overwhelming confusion set in. The atmosphere in the room had changed drastically. The tension of the imminent threat dissipated, but was replaced by a quietness charged with something she could not name. It was strange, delicate, and incredibly heavy. Ricardo looked from the cookie in his hand to Sophia's eyes, and then, for the first time, he looked at Lucia. It was not a look from boss to employee, nor one of contempt. It was a lost look, stripped of all its armor, the look of a man who had just been jolted from a trance. Without another word, he turned and walked back to his office, closing the door softly behind him, leaving mother and daughter alone in the silence of that gigantic apartment, with the taste of an inexplicable and frightening miracle in the air. Lucia remained motionless for a long moment, the echo of the closing door still resonating in her bones. The fear, which was once a violent current threatening to drown her, receded into a ripple of pure and complete bewilderment. She looked at Sophia, who, oblivious to the emotional earthquake she had just caused, had already found a small corner near the gigantic window and was playing quietly with a small rag doll that Lucia had brought hidden. In her bag, the sight of her daughter, so small and so powerful, filled her heart with a mixture of dread and admiration. With her hands still trembling, she tried to resume her work. Her actions were mechanical, devoid of thought. She polished a coffee table that already gleamed with perfection, cleaned a bookshelf of books that seemed never to have been touched, but her mind was stuck on that scene. She replayed Ricardo's gaze, the hesitation of his hand, the hoarseness of his voice. Every detail was analyzed and dissected in search of a meaning that escaped her. The rest of her shift was completed in a state of high alert, like an animal walking through an unknown and dangerous territory. Every creak of the building, every distant sound made her jump, expecting the office door to open and reality, with its usual cruelty, to reassert itself. Leaving that apartment at the end of the day was like waking from a trance, leaving behind a place where the impossible seemed to have happened. Behind the solid oak door, Ricardo Mendez did not return to his spreadsheets or to the lines of code that governed his empire. He sank into his leather chair, his body as heavy as if he carried the burden of 7 years all at once. On the black, immaculate surface of his desk rested the piece of cornstarch cookie. That fragile, insignificant object seemed to pulse with more life than anything else in his sanctuary of luxury. He stared at it for a time he could not measure. That cookie was an artifact from a world he had exiled himself from, a world of afternoon snacks, of scraped knees, and of spontaneous laughter. It was the antithesis of his calculated existence. His fingers traced the outline of the cookie, feeling the granular texture of the sugar. With a movement that required more courage than closing any billion-dollar deal, he brought it to his lips and took a small bite. The flavor, absurdly simple and sweet, flooded his palate and unlocked memory banks he had kept chained. It was the taste of the childhood he barely had and the fatherhood that had been stolen from him. The wall of his pain had not fallen, but for the first time, a single hot tear ran down his face, tracing a path in the dust of his soul and proving that somewhere inside, something was still alive. That night was a long corridor of insomnia for Lucia. Lying in her bed, with Sophia's body nestled beside her, she replayed the day in an infinite loop. The image of the ice giant, the feared Ricardo Mendez, accepting her daughter's cookie, was so vivid and so absurd that it seemed to belong in a movie, not her life. With each passing hour, doubt gnawed at her from within. What would she do the next day? Common sense screamed for her to find some other solution for Sophia, not to press her luck twice. Yet a part of her, a part she barely recognized, felt that Sophia's presence had been the only thing that had saved her from being fired. It was a terrifying paradox. The source of her greatest risk was also her only and inexplicable shield. At dawn, with her heart heavy with uncertainty and necessity speaking louder than fear, she made her decision. She dressed Sophia, put the ragdoll in her small backpack, and set off for the battlefield once more, feeling like a tightrope walker, with no idea what awaited her on the other side. Ricardo, for his part, had not had a peaceful night either. Sleep, which was once an empty refuge, was populated by fragmented dreams and the phantom sensation of vanilla taste in his mouth. That morning his iron routine was broken. He did not immediately lock himself away with his reports. Instead, he found himself in a state of waiting, of listening. The sound of the elevator arriving at the penthouse floor caused a reaction in his body he had not felt in years. Anticipation. He heard the soft click of the door, Lucia's whispers to her daughter, and the once irritating sound of Sophia's little feet on the marble. He left his office. Door ajar, a crack into the world he had blocked out. The silence of the apartment was no longer the same. It was now a stage, and he awaited the entrance of the little actress. After an hour of muffled sounds of play and the hum of the vacuum cleaner, he stood up. With the excuse of getting a glass of water, he went to the kitchen. Lucia and Sophia were in the adjacent room. He did not look at them. He opened a cabinet, took a small, elegant box of Belgian chocolates he had received from a client and never opened, and left it on the kitchen counter in a visible place. Without a word, he turned and returned to his den, his heart beating in a strange and unfamiliar way. It was only when Lucia began to clean the kitchen countertop, an island of black granite so polished it looked like a reflecting pool, that she saw the object. The box of chocolates was a deep blue, tied with a golden satin ribbon, a small treasure resting there, completely out of place in her reality. Her first thought was that it was not for her. Perhaps a visitor had forgotten it, or it was a gift that Mr. Mendez would take to someone. Touching it seemed like a transgression. However, the box was positioned in a very deliberate way, exactly in the center of the counter, impossible to ignore. A wave of heat and cold ran through her body. That silent, anonymous gesture could only have come from him. But why? Was it a test? A strange form of charity that humiliated her even more? For someone like Lucia, who fought for every cent with dignity, the idea of receiving something so expensive for no apparent reason was disconcerting. To accept it would be to cross an invisible boundary, to step out of the role of an employee and into a personal and dangerous territory. She felt the weight of his invisible gaze, even through the closed door, and her survival instinct screamed for her to ignore the box and continue her work as if nothing had happened. While Lucia fought her internal battle, paralyzed by the analysis of all possible consequences, a clear, curious little voice cut through the air. "Mommy, what a pretty box!" Sophia, with her bright eyes, was pointing to the counter. The innocence of her daughter's question was like a ray of light in the darkness of Lucia's anxiety. For Sophia, there were no ulterior motives, no fear or social hierarchy. There was only a pretty box. In that moment, Lucia understood that ignoring the gesture would be as significant a response as accepting it, and perhaps an ungrateful one. She took a deep breath, the air filling her lungs with a courage she didn't know she possessed. She made a decision that went against all her instincts to remain invisible. With trembling hands, she opened the box, revealing perfectly sculpted chocolates. She did not take one for herself. She took the smallest one and gave it to Sophia, who smiled in delight. And then, holding her daughter's little hand, she walked towards the office door. With her heart hammering against her ribs, she knelt and whispered to her daughter, "Thank the man, my love. Knock on the door very gently." The soft sound of a 4-year-old's knuckles on the solid wood sounded louder than any thunder in that silence. Inside the office, the sound was so soft that Ricardo at first thought he had imagined it. It was a phantom touch, an acoustic anomaly in his hermetically sealed world. He stood motionless, his muscles tense. His silent offering of the chocolates was meant to be the end of the conversation, a monologue, not the beginning of a dialogue. The idea of a direct interaction, of having to face Lucia and her daughter, sent his reclusive instinct blaring like an alarm. The fortress that was his heart, whose walls he had spent 7 years reinforcing, screamed for him to ignore it, to pretend he hadn't heard and wait for them to leave. It would be the easiest, the safest thing to do. But then, the image of the little yellow-gloved hand, the taste of the cornstarch in cookie, the single tear that had run down his face the day before, all of this weighed on the scale. A force that was not reason, but a mixture of curiosity and a deep forgotten need for connection, compelled him to stand up. Each step to the door was an internal negotiation between the man he was and the ghost of the man he once wanted to be. As he turned the handle and opened the door, he was not prepared for the scene that awaited him. His height, framed by the dark doorway, was that of a giant. But his gaze did not first meet Lucia's, who stood a step behind, pale as wax, holding her breath. His gaze was captured by the tiny figure standing directly in front of him. Sophia, her face slightly smudged with chocolate, looked up at him with the same fearless curiosity as the day before. Behind her innocence, he could see the mother, a statue of fear and courage, a lioness protecting her cub, while at the same time offering her up for the most dangerous of truces. The little one raised her hand, now free of the glove, and mumbled a "thank you," her attempt to say "thank you." The sound, imperfect and sweet, hit Ricardo with the force of a wave. It was then that Lucia found her voice, a trembling thread of sound. "I'm sorry, sir. I know I shouldn't have, but I thought she needed to thank you. You didn't have to bother with the gift." She was apologizing, but she was also taking a stand, defending the dignity of her gratitude. Ricardo lowered his gaze to Sophia, and something unprecedented happened. A tiny, almost imperceptible twitch at the corner of his lips, the shadow of a smile. "It was no bother," he said, his voice still hoarse. "I'm glad you liked it." When the office door closed, Lucia felt the air return to her lungs in a rush so strong it left her momentarily dizzy. The adrenaline that had kept her standing dissipated, leaving in its place a trembling and profound relief. She had done it. She had faced the unknown, the man everyone feared, and not only survived, but had been met with a fraction of kindness. The word seemed inadequate to describe the fleeting expression on Ricardo Mendez's face, but it was the only one that came to mind. In that moment, as she guided Sophia back to her play corner, something fundamental changed within her. The raw fear she felt for that man began to transform. The image of the inaccessible tyrant began to be overlaid with the image of a terribly lonely man, a king exiled in his own castle of pain. The sadness that emanated from him was almost palpable, and for the first time, Lucia felt a pang of empathy, an emotion she never imagined associating with his figure. The rest of the workday transpired under a new light. The silence of the apartment no longer seemed threatening, but melancholic. And Lucia, for the first time, even allowed herself to hum a lullaby softly to Sophia, her voice a thread of domestic warmth, weaving a new tapestry in the air of that place. On the other side of the door, Ricardo sat at his desk, but he did not see the charts on the computer screen. He saw Lucia's face, the mixture of dread and dignity in her eyes. He was used to two types of people, those who feared him and cowered, and those who flattered him in search of something. Lucia did not fit into either category. She feared him, yes, but her courage in coming to his door to ensure a debt of gratitude was paid revealed an integrity that completely disarmed him. She wanted nothing from him. That simple act of thanks was pure, an end in itself. The realization hit him with an uncomfortable clarity. His wall of isolation, which he thought was impenetrable, actually had a gate. And those two, mother and daughter, had found the key not with force, but with gestures of a disarming simplicity. After long minutes in silence, he made a decision that went against the instinct that had governed him for 7 years. He stood up and opened his office door. He did not open it completely, just a crack, a small fissure into the world. And for the rest of the afternoon, he worked with that crack open, allowing the soft sounds of life, the hum of the vacuum, a muffled laugh from Sophia, Lucia's voice, to penetrate his fortress, not as an invasion, but as the distant promise of a spring after an endless winter. The days that followed unfolded in a new and unexpected rhythm. That single encounter at the office door established a precedent, a silent truce that neither of them dared to break with words. Lucia continued to bring Sophia, the anxiety in her chest replaced by a careful vigilance, like someone protecting a fragile flame from the wind. Their routine acquired small rituals. Ricardo's office door always remained ajar, a silent concession to their presence. And Lucia began to notice small anomalies in the kitchen, gestures of a clumsy and anonymous generosity. A carton of grape juice, the favorite brand of children, would appear in the refrigerator next to the bottles of imported water. A bunch of perfectly ripe bananas would appear in the fruit bowl that previously only held green apples, the only ones she ever saw him eat. They were messages in code, the only language that reclusive man seemed capable of using to say, "I see you." Lucia, in turn, responded in the same language. Noticing that he went days on end without a real meal, she began to leave. Before she left, a small covered plate on the counter with a simple sandwich or a slice of the cornmeal cake she had made at home. It was a silent dialogue, an exchange of care that crossed the social and emotional abyss that separated them. From his observation post, Ricardo became a spectator of the life he had banished from his domains. The crack in the door was his window to a universe he had forgotten existed. He learned the rhythms of that small duo. He heard the stories that Lucia told in whispers to her daughter while she mopped the floor, tales of fairies and talking animals that filled the marble silence. He heard Sophia's off-key songs, invented melodies that became the new and bizarre soundtrack to his days. On his rare exits from the office, he would see, at a glance, the drawings the girl made on the living room floor, with colored wax crayons that had mysteriously appeared in a drawer. Those sounds and images which would have once been an affront to his pain were now like a balm. The silence he so cherished began to seem hollow to him, synonymous with emptiness and no longer with peace. One day, he heard Sophia imitating her mother, reading a story to her rag doll in a serious, bossy little voice. Alone in his office, Ricardo smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. He was no longer just tolerating life in his house. He was, dangerously, beginning to like it. Almost 2 months passed in that routine of understood silences and anonymous kindnesses. Trust, a delicate plant, grew slowly in the once sterile environment of the apartment. One day, a Friday, with a gray sky that announced the arrival of winter, Lucia was finishing her work. Believing that Ricardo was in one of his long conference calls, she answered her cell phone, speaking softly to her sister. The office door, as usual, was ajar, and Ricardo, who for the first time in years had finished his work early, overheard the conversation. Lucia's voice was tinged with a soft melancholy, a resignation he was beginning to recognize. "I know, sis. The holiday is coming up. No, we're just staying here." Sophia won't stop talking about seeing pretend snow after she saw it in a cartoon. She keeps asking me for us to go to a place with a mountain and lots of cold. Oh, but how? That's for rich people, right? We'll have to be content with seeing it on television. Those words, spoken without self-pity, merely as a statement of fact, hit Ricardo with unexpected force. That simple desire of a child to see the cold and the mother's silent inability to fulfill it ignited a protective impulse in him, a need to act that was stronger than his habit of reclusion. He didn't think, didn't calculate the risks or the possible interpretations of his gesture. For the first time in a long time, he acted on pure instinct, an instinct he thought had died with Helena. He stood up and walked out of the office, stopping in the middle of the living room. Lucia, who had already hung up the phone and was gathering her and Sophia's things to leave, jumped in fright seeing him there, standing like a statue. Her first thought was panic. He had heard her on the phone and was going to fire her for using work time for personal matters. She felt her blood run cold. "Mr. Mendes, I'm sorry, she began to stammer. He raised a hand, not in an authoritarian way, but to calm her. "Lucia," he said, his voice firm, but without the icy tone of before. "I overheard your conversation. I didn't mean to." He paused, and his eyes met hers. "I have a cabin in Campos do Jordão. It's always empty. I would like for you and your daughter to spend the holiday there, so she can see the mountains." The sentence hung in the air between them, so colossal and unlikely that Lucia's brain refused to process it. She stood in complete silence, blinking, her mouth slightly open, trying to find some meaning in those words that seemed to belong to a language from another planet. Lucia's mind was a whirlwind. His words echoed in her head, but they refused to form a coherent idea. A cabin, Campos do Jordão, a weekend. They were pieces of a puzzle from another life, not hers. Instinct, sharpened by years of hardship and mistrust, took over. Such grand gestures from such powerful people were never free. There was always a price, a hidden expectation, a debt that would be collected later. The fear of a trap, of a situation she couldn't control, was much greater than the desire to accept. With a trembling voice, she finally managed to articulate a response, the words coming out hurried and full of panic. "Mr. Mendes, I thank you really, but I can't accept. No way. It's too kind. I don't deserve it. I'm just your cleaner. It wouldn't make sense." Every word of refusal was a desperate attempt to rebuild the wall between them, to return to the safety of her defined role, where the rules, though harsh, were clear. Accepting this would be to launch herself into the unknown, and the unknown had always been dangerous for her. Ricardo listened to her refusal with a patience that surprised him. He had expected it. Her dignity, her refusal to accept what could be seen as charity, was precisely the quality that had captivated him in the first place. He didn't try to use emotional appeal. Instead, he resorted to the only tool he mastered with perfection: cold logic and problem solving. "This is not about deserving it, Lucia. It's about utility. The cabin stays closed all year round, which is not good for the structure. Consider it a task. You will air out the place for me." He reframed the offer in a way that transformed it into an obligation, not a favor, a calculated genius to bypass her pride. And before she could protest again, he continued, his voice leaving no room for debate. "A car with a driver I trust will be at the door of your building on Friday at 8 in the morning. He will take you there and bring you back on Sunday night. The refrigerator will be stocked with everything you need. The key will be with him. This is not a discussion, Lucia. It's a logistical arrangement." He left her without arguments, his practicality completely disarming her mistrust. Lucia stared at him, the reality finally sinking in. This was real, and it was happening. Friday arrived as if it were the day of a coronation or an execution. Lucia wasn't sure which. Punctually at 8 in the morning, a black car, so polished it looked like an onyx jewel, stopped in front of her simple building, causing a shocked silence among the neighbors having their coffee at the corner bakery. A driver in a dark suit got out, and with a courtesy Lucia had only seen in movies, opened the back door for her and Sophia. Getting into that vehicle was like being transported to another dimension. The smell of new leather and the almost absolute silence of the interior were an overwhelming contrast to the noise and bustle of her world. Lucia sat on the edge of the soft seat, afraid of dirtying or wrinkling anything, holding Sophia's hand like an anchor to reality. As the car glided away from her neighborhood, she looked out the window, watching the familiar landscapes dissolve, feeling a lump in her throat. It was a mixture of ecstasy and guilt, the feeling of living a dream that did not belong to her. Sophia, on the other hand, was at the pinnacle of her existence. With her face pressed against the glass, her little eyes shone, absorbing every new image of the road as if it were the greatest show on earth. The pure and unbridled joy of her daughter was the only thing keeping Lucia's heart from exploding with anxiety. After a few hours of travel, the landscape transformed. Concrete gave way to the lush green of the Mantiqueira Mountains, and the air coming through the car's filters felt colder, purer, "Mommy, the mountains!" shouted Sophia, and Lucia felt a tear escape. It was real. The car finally entered through a wooden gate and stopped in front of a house that seemed to have come out of a fairy tale. A cabin of fine wood and stone with immense windows that reflected the surrounding araucaria trees, and a chimney from which a welcoming wisp of smoke emerged. The driver opened the door, and the cold mountain air, smelling of pine and damp earth, enveloped them. Lucia stood paralyzed at the entrance, unable to take a step. Through the open door, she saw a living room with a crackling fireplace, sofas that seemed to embrace whoever sat on them, and an open-plan kitchen whose refrigerator, she would soon discover, was stocked as if for a banquet. That place was not a sanctuary of solitude like the penthouse. It was a refuge of warmth and comfort. The realization hit her like a punch. The man who lived in a glass mausoleum in São Paulo owned this nest of coziness. Before she could process the paradox, Sophia let go of her hand and ran inside, her laughter echoing through the room, the first sound of genuine joy to fill those walls in, Lucia suspected, a very, very long time. With hesitant steps, Lucia followed her daughter's laughter into the cabin. Every room she explored was a new layer of wonder. It was not the cold opulence of the apartment, but a luxury that embraced, that invited rest. There was a soft wool blanket thrown over the sofa, a pile of books next to the fireplace, and in the kitchen, all the ingredients one could wish for to make hot chocolate. Upon opening the door to one of the bedrooms, her heart leaped. There were 2 beds, one double and one for a child, both perfectly made with sheets that smelled of lavender, and on the smaller bed, a brand new teddy bear and 2 children's storybooks awaited. That detail, that small, thoughtful kindness, was what finally broke down Lucia's barriers. The tears she had been holding back came uncontrollably, not of sadness or fear, but of a gratitude so overwhelming it left her breathless. She sat on the edge of the bed, watching Sophia, who was already hugging the bear like an old friend, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to take a deep breath and feel peace. In that refuge of wood and warmth, built by a man she so feared, Lucia felt miraculously safe. Meanwhile, in São Paulo, the silence in Ricardo Mendes's penthouse had become an enemy. The emptiness, which was once his shield, now suffocated him. The apartment, without the muffled sounds of Lucia and Sophia, seemed like a hollow shell, an echo of his own loneliness. He paced back and forth, unable to concentrate on work. His mind was miles away, in the cold. Mountains. Did they arrive safely? Was the driver courteous? Did Sophia like the house? The concern was a strange and insistent sensation, an unknown warmth in his frozen chest. Unable to bear the uncertainty, he picked up his cell phone, a gesture he normally only made to seal deals. He accessed Lucia's employee file and looked at her number for a long moment. Calling would be too invasive, a breach of the unspoken rules of their arrangement. Instead, with slightly trembling fingers, he wrote a text message, short, functional, almost cold. "I hope you arrived safely. The Wi-Fi password is Helena 1985. If there is any problem, the caretaker lives in the house next door." He sent it and then stared at the screen, waiting for a reply with an anxiety he hadn't felt since he waited for news of his wife 7 years ago. The buzz of the cell phone in her purse sounded strange and out of place in that sanctuary of peace. Lucia's heart leaped when she saw the name Ricardo Mendes on the screen. A shiver of apprehension ran through her. Had he changed his mind? Was he going to ask them to come back? With trembling fingers, she opened the message. The text was formal, almost cold, but the words contained an undeniable concern. And then she saw the Wi-Fi password, Helena 1985. That detail, so specific and personal, hit her in an unexpected way. Helena. It was a name, a woman's name, and 1985, a year. Birth, marriage. Lucia didn't know, but she felt that unintentionally she had. been given a key not only to the internet, but to the vault of that man's soul. That password explained the sadness in his eyes, the emptiness of his home, the joyless luxury. He was not a monster of coldness. He was a man haunted by a name and a year. Feeling a wave of empathy and an even deeper respect, she drafted her reply carefully, choosing each word to convey her gratitude without betraying that she had noticed the indiscretion. "We arrived safely, sir. The place is a dream. There are no words to thank you. Sophia is loving every second. Thank you so much." She sent it, feeling that her relationship with that man had just deepened in a silent and sacred way. That weekend became an oasis in the desert of Lucia's life. It was a time of firsts that were etched in her memory with crystal clarity. The first time Sophia saw frost covering the grass in the morning and shouted, amazed, that the pretend snow had arrived. The first time the two of them sat in front of a real fireplace with mugs of steaming hot chocolate, reading the books he had left. For Lucia, it was the first time in years that she didn't have to think about the next day, the bill to pay, the clock ticking. She could simply be a mother. The worry lines on her forehead softened, and her laughter, a sound that had become rare, echoed freely in the garden as she ran after a euphoric Sophia. They baked a cake in the spacious kitchen, walked among the tall trees, and at night fell asleep to the sound of crackling firewood. The cabin, which perhaps had once been planned for another family, for another Sophia, was being filled with the life and healing it so desperately needed. Those 2 days were not just a holiday, they were a rebirth, an injection of hope and joy that would change the chemistry of their souls forever. The return trip on Sunday night was silent, but in a completely different way from the journey there. Lucia's anxiety had been replaced by a sweet melancholy, the feeling of waking from the most beautiful dream of her life. She looked at the lights of São Paulo approaching on the horizon, not with the usual discouragement, but with a new strength in her heart. That weekend had refueled her, reminding her that beauty existed and that kindness could spring from the most unexpected places. Her gratitude for Ricardo Mendes had transformed into something more complex. It was not just gratitude, it was a form of concern, of affection. She thought of him, alone in that vastness of glass and marble, and her heart ached. He had given them a paradise and returned to his prison. Sophia, asleep in the back seat, hugged the teddy bear tightly. Before falling asleep, she whispered to her mother a sentence that summed it all up. "I liked the sad man's house in the mountains, Mummy. He's not so sad now, is he?" The question, of a devastating purity, echoed in Lucia's mind for the entire journey home. The following Tuesday, upon entering the penthouse again, the atmosphere seemed fundamentally altered. For Lucia, the apartment was no longer a cold mausoleum, but the cocoon of a man she was beginning to understand. There was an unspoken intimacy in the air, a shared secret that united the three of them. It wasn't long before the office door opened. Ricardo appeared, but the rigid posture of before was gone. His shoulders seemed more relaxed, and in his eyes there was an almost anxious curiosity. He didn't know how to start, how to ask, but he didn't have to. Sophia, who now saw this man not as a figure to be feared, but as the owner of the magical house, ran towards him. She held up the teddy bear for him to see. "Mister, look at my new friend. His name is Tummy Flutters." The spontaneous and funny name made Ricardo blink, and then, in a gesture that made Lucia's heart stop, he knelt, becoming almost the same height as the girl. His large, pale hand touched the bear's head. "That's a great name," he said, his voice surprisingly soft. He then raised his gaze to Lucia, and the question came, direct and without preamble. "The weekend, did everything go well?" Lucia, for the first time in his presence, smiled a wide and genuine smile. "It was more than well, Mr. Mendes. It was unforgettable. Thank you." That brief meeting on Tuesday was the floodgate that opened. From that day on, the dynamic in the penthouse changed irrevocably. Ricardo's office door was no longer just ajar. Most of the time it remained wide open, and Sophia, in her childlike wisdom, understood this as a permanent invitation. She, who was once instructed to play quietly in her corner, now made little pilgrimages to the office threshold to narrate her adventures. "Mister, today at the little park I saw a dog that looked like a lion. He went woof, real deep," she would recount, gesturing with her whole body. Ricardo at first just watched her from his chair, a nod here, a near smile there. But gradually, the gravity of her presence pulled him in. He began to stand up, to lean against the doorframe, to better hear the stories. For a man who measured time in millions of dollars, those minutes dedicated to hearing about lion dogs and ants in a line were the most valuable investment he made in his day. Lucia watched from a distance, her heart tight with an emotion that was a knot of gratitude, relief, and a tenderness she dared not name, seeing her daughter teach a man how to live again. Ricardo's transformation from spectator to participant was subtle but constant. One day, he saw Sophia on the living room rug, frowning at a page from one of the books he had left at the cabin, struggling with a longer word. After a moment of visible hesitation, where he fought a brief internal battle, he walked over to her. He didn't sit on the floor, that was still too intimate a barrier, but he pulled a chair nearby and sat down. "That word is extraordinary," he said, his voice calm. "It means something very, very special, like a squirrel that knows how to dance." Sophia laughed, and Ricardo helped her read the rest of the page. That small act of sharing knowledge, of actively participating in her discovery, lit a new light within him. He began to notice the sparkling intelligence in the girl's eyes, the speed with which she absorbed everything, and with this perception came a nagging concern. He saw Sophia's limitless potential and at the same time understood the barriers the world would impose on her because of her circumstances. The thought that this bright flame could be diminished by a lack of opportunity began to form in his mind, not as an act of charity, but as a mission. That talent, that light, needed to be protected and cultivated. Ricardo Mendes's mind, accustomed to analyzing markets and predicting technological trends, was now focused on a single, passionate mission: Sophia's future. He spent sleepless nights, not in front of financial projections, but immersed in school websites, researching pedagogical curricula, environments, and teaching philosophies. He was not just looking for the most expensive or prestigious institution, but a place that would be a nest, a fertile environment where Sophia's curiosity could flourish without being pruned by prejudice or arrogance. For him, this became the most important project of his life. In his internal logic, he did not see the act as charity, but as the wisest of investments. The business world had taught him that the most valuable resources were the rarest, and the human potential, the intelligence and kindness he saw in Sophia, were an asset the world could not afford to waste. By creating a trust fund in Sofia Oliveira's name, he felt he was not just giving a gift. He was correcting a flaw in the system, an injustice of fate. He was, perhaps, building a legacy that money alone could never buy. On a Thursday afternoon, as Lucia was preparing to leave, Ricardo approached her with a formality that made her stomach freeze. "Lucia, could you spare me a few minutes, please?" He led her to the living room sofas, but did not sit, remaining standing in a somewhat awkward posture, his hands in his pockets. "I have been observing Sophia for the past few months," he began, his voice serious. "She is one of the brightest and most perceptive children I have ever seen." Lucia felt a warmth of pride, but also of apprehension. Where was he going with this? "Talent," he continued, "without opportunity is like a bird without a sky to fly in, and I believe there is nothing more important than ensuring that a child like her has a limitless sky." He paused, searching for the right words. "I have taken the liberty of creating an educational fund for her. It covers all costs, from tuition to materials, at one of the best schools in the city, until she graduates from university. Don't see this as a gift, Lucia. It is a tool, just a tool to ensure that she can compete on equal footing with anyone. I need you to accept." Lucia stared at him, but his words were so monumental that they seemed not to fit into her understanding. The trip to Campos de Jordão was a dream, but this was the rewriting of a destiny. Tears began to roll down her face, silent and heavy, the only response her shocked body could muster. Lucia tried to speak, but her voice was just a choked sob. The tears were a curtain that blurred the figure of Ricardo before her, transforming him into a silhouette of incomprehensible generosity. She brought her hands to her face, trying to contain an emotion that was too big for her body. How was this possible? How could a man who, months before, was the personification of fear, now be the guardian angel of her daughter's future? She finally managed to lift her gaze, her eyes red and swollen, and the question that was trapped in her soul escaped as a desperate whisper. "Why, Mr. Mendez? Why are you doing this? This changes everything. It changes her life forever. I will never, not in a million years, be able to thank you to repay you for this." The word repay came out with the weight of her entire life, the notion that everything has a cost, that favors of this magnitude create unpayable debts. She was not just accepting, she was desperately trying to understand the reason behind the miracle. Hearing her question, Ricardo felt the last of his internal walls tremble. He saw Lucia's pure and overwhelming gratitude and knew he could no longer hide behind anonymous gestures or logical explanations. She deserved the truth. He finally sat on the sofa opposite hers, the gesture diminishing the distance and formality between them. He took a deep breath, the air seeming heavy in his lungs. "You don't have to repay me anything, Lucia," he said, his voice low and laden with an old pain. It is I who am trying to pay a debt that can never be settled." He looked at an empty spot in the room, his eyes seeing a past she could not see. 7 years ago, my wife Helena died in a car accident. She was 8 months pregnant. Each word was a stone he removed from his chest. "We were expecting a girl. We already had the room ready, the toys, the dreams, everything." He paused, swallowing hard before delivering the final sentence that would connect all the pieces. "The name we chose for her was Sophia." The revelation hung in the air, silent and devastating, explaining everything. The initial shock, the Wi-Fi password, the cabin in the mountains, and the almost desperate need to protect Lucia's little Sophia. Ricardo's confession hung in the air, and suddenly Lucia's universe rearranged itself around that new and tragic truth. Every piece of the puzzle fell into place with painful clarity. The apartment that was a mausoleum, the silence that was a penance, the pain in his eyes that she had once mistaken for arrogance. It was all grief. Her tears, which had been of pure gratitude, now mingled with an empathy so deep it ached in her own chest. In that instant, all social barriers, all differences of class and power that existed between them were pulverized. She no longer saw the millionaire, the boss, the intimidating man. She saw only a human being devastated by an unimaginable loss. On an impulse that came from the depths of her soul, she stood up, walked the few steps that separated them, and sat down beside him on the sofa. With a hesitation that lasted only a second, she reached out and gently placed her hand on his forearm. A simple touch, a gesture of pure human comfort. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice choked. "I am so sorry for your pain, for your Helena, and for your Sophia." Lucia's touch was the final straw that broke the dam of pain Ricardo had built for 7 years. The physical contact, so simple and so charged with compassion, unraveled the last fiber of his self-control. He did not cry loudly. It was a silent, internal collapse. His broad shoulders trembled, and the tears he had swallowed for 2,555 days, finally found a way out, streaming down his face in a quiet, uncontrollable flow. He did not pull away from her touch. On the contrary, he seemed to lean on that small anchor of human warmth, like a castaway who finally finds solid ground. In that shared silence, broken only by the soft sound of his tears, their relationship was forged into something new and indestructible. Lucia's gratitude had transformed into a deep, protective affection, and Ricardo's admiration for her strength and his affection for Sophia now merged into an overwhelming feeling for this woman. The woman who, with a cookie and a touch, had crossed his private winter and shown him that the sun could still rise. In that moment, in the midst of the pain, love began to be born. The days following Ricardo's confession were like the sunrise after a long, stormy night. The truth, though painful, cleared the air between them. Lucia no longer tiptoed around. She moved through the penthouse with the ease of someone who is at home. Their relationship, stripped of all formalities and hierarchies, blossomed into a genuine intimacy. Conversations were no longer just about work or Sophia's cute antics. Ricardo began to ask about Lucia's life, about her dreams before she became a mother, about the small joys and great struggles that shaped her. He would leave his office no longer on an impulse, but out of a real desire to be near her, to hear her voice as she hummed, to share a comfortable silence. While Sophia took a nap, and Lucia, in turn, allowed herself to see the man behind the tragedy. She saw his dry humor, his brilliant intelligence, and the kindness he tried to disguise with practical gestures. The affection she felt for him, born of gratitude and empathy, deepened into something that made her heart race whenever he smiled, a smile that now, finally, reached his eyes. The transition from that deep friendship to romance happened as naturally as the changing of the seasons. One day, Ricardo approached her with a plan. Sophia's enrollment in the new school needs to be done in person, and there are some documents I need to sign as the fund's guarantor, he said, the excuse perfectly plausible. I was thinking of going with you tomorrow. And afterwards, he hesitated. The vulnerability in his eyes was something Lucia had grown to adore. Afterwards, we could have lunch out to celebrate. Sophia deserves a big celebration for this new phase. The invitation, disguised as an obligation and centered on Sophia, was Ricardo's way of asking her out on a date without the weight and formality of the word. It was a step outside the bubble of the penthouse, a test to see how they functioned as a unit in the outside world. Lucia felt her face flush, but her smile was immediate and radiant. We would love that, Ricardo. It was the first time she had called him by his first name, without the Mr. in front. The sound of his name on her lips was, for Ricardo, the confirmation that he was, finally, on the right path. The next day, the three of them left the luxury building together, not as boss and employee, but as something resembling a family. Upon arriving at the school, an imposing brick building surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens, Lucia felt a chill of inadequacy. This was a universe of privilege that she never imagined her daughter could even visit. However, Ricardo seemed to sense her discomfort. He moved with a calm and protective authority, handling all the bureaucracy, introducing Lucia to the headmistress with a respect that made her feel like the most important person in the room. At one point, while explaining the fund's situation, he said, "We want to ensure that our Sophia has the best tools for the future." The word "our," spoken so naturally, resonated in Lucia's ears like the most beautiful symphony. There, in that administration office, as she watched the man she loved defending her daughter's future as if it were his own, Lucia no longer saw a promise of a future. She saw the future, real and palpable, unfolding right before her. Lunch was at a charming and well-lit Italian restaurant, a place that was elegant, but also welcomed a child's loud laughter. Seated at the table, with Sophia between them drawing on the children's menu, the conversation flowed with a lightness that would have been unthinkable months ago. They talked about simple things, favorite foods, movies they liked to watch, the most beautiful places they had. ever known. There was no longer the shadow of pain or the weight of gratitude between them, only the joy of two people discovering each other's world. Ricardo looked at Lucia, at the way her eyes shone when she smiled, and at Sophia, who proudly displayed her drawing of a princess and a bear, and felt a warmth fill the void he had carried in his chest for so long. This was happiness, simple, real. In a gesture that seemed the most natural thing in the world, he reached his hand across the white linen tablecloth and covered Lucia's hand with his. She wasn't startled. She simply turned her palm up and intertwined her fingers with his. In that touch, in that public handhold, a silent commitment was sealed. They were no longer three people united by pain and chance. They were the beginning of a family. The following months were a collage of happy moments that rewrote Ricardo's past of pain and Lucia's future of uncertainty. Sophia flourished in the new school, a sponge for knowledge and joy, and the trio's routine settled into a comfortable cadence of weekends at the park, dinners at home, and the complicity of those building a life together. The love between Ricardo and Lucia, born in such unusual circumstances, matured and became a safe harbor for both. One day, during another weekend at the cabin in Campos de Jordão, the place that had become the sanctuary of their new beginning, Ricardo stopped beside Lucia as they watched Sophia chase butterflies in the garden. "I lived for 7 years in a palace of ice, waiting for time to pass," he said, his voice firm with a new certainty. "You showed me that life is not meant to be waited for. It's meant to be lived. And I don't want to live in that apartment anymore. It belongs to a past that I want to honor, but no longer inhabit." He turned to her, his eyes shining with emotion. "I want to build a home, Lucia, a real home, with a garden for Sophia and space for our laughter, a place that is ours from scratch." Ricardo's proposal was not just about a new address. It was about the foundation of a new world, a world that would belong only to them. Lucia, whose heart now knew the language of his soul, needed no time to think. Her yes was immediate, a whisper full of tears of joy that sealed their fate. The following weeks were an adventure. The tech mogul, who once only pored over software projects and market analyses, now spent his nights with Lucia, looking at house plans and seriously debating the perfect color for Sophia's room. Her opinion was the only one that mattered. He saw her not as someone being saved, but as his partner, the architect of his new happiness. Together, they chose a house in a leafy neighborhood of São Paulo, a house with white walls ready to be filled with new memories and a large backyard where soon there would be the sound of a swing and Sophia's laughter. Moving out of the penthouse apartment was a ritual. As he closed that door for the last time, Ricardo was not just leaving a property behind. He was saying goodbye to the man he had been, the lonely king of a kingdom of pain, to finally become the man Lucia and Sophia had taught him to be, a husband and a father. In the new house, life found a rhythm of serene happiness. Ricardo rediscovered the joy of coming home to a house full of smells and sounds. Sophia had a garden for her adventures, and Lucia, for the first time, had space to be who she was. And it was in her new kitchen, large and sunny, that a long-dormant talent awakened with impressive force. The simple meals she made, once limited by a tight budget, now transformed into spectacular creations. She combined ingredients with the intuition of an artist, turning family dinners into memorable feasts. Her gift for cooking was undeniable, a form of love she put into every dish. Ricardo, who had dined at the most starred restaurants in the world, was the first to recognize the dimension of her talent. He would watch her in the kitchen, completely immersed in her art, and see the same passion and genius he dedicated to technology. What for Lucia was just a way of caring for her family, for him was the manifestation of a rare and precious gift. One evening, after a dinner, he considered one of the best meals of his life. Ricardo sat with Lucia on the porch under a starry sky. "Lucia, "We need to talk about your future," he said, and she looked at him, confused. "Our future is great," she replied. "Yes," he agreed, "but I'm talking about your talent. What you do in the kitchen isn't just cooking, it's art, it's an experience. Have you ever thought of turning it into a career?" The suggestion caught her by surprise and she laughed, a self-deprecating laugh. "Me? Imagine, Ricardo. I'm just an amateur cook." It was then that he leaned forward, the intensity in his eyes unmistakable. "I invested in Sophia's future because I saw her potential. Now, I want to invest in yours, not as a gift, but as a business partner. I'll handle the boring part, the numbers, the marketing. You handle the magic. Let's open a restaurant, a place that reflects your soul. The world deserves to taste your food, my love." His seriousness and unwavering faith in her potential struck a deep chord in Lucia. This was not a proposal from a rich husband to his wife. It was the recognition of one genius by another. And for the first time, Lucia allowed herself to dream of a success that was all her own. The restaurant project became the couple's joint passion. Ricardo, with his strategic vision, and Lucia, with her creative soul, formed an unbeatable team. He found the perfect spot, a charming old house in an upscale neighborhood, which they renovated to create an ambiance that was the spitting image of Lucia, elegant without being snobbish, welcoming and full of warmth. While Ricardo handled the permits, the suppliers, and the assembly of a first-rate team, Lucia locked herself in the kitchen, designing a menu that was her. Biography in the form of dishes. There were reinterpretations of simple recipes from her childhood, now executed with impeccable technique, and daring creations born of her newfound confidence. One day, while discussing the name of the establishment, Ricardo had an idea that made Lucia cry with emotion. "What if we called it Helena and Sophia's?" he suggested, his voice choked. "To honor the daughter who taught me about pain and the daughter who taught me how to live again." In that name, Ricardo's past and present finally made peace, and the restaurant gained a soul even before it opened its doors. The opening night of Helena and Sophia's was an event that stopped the city. Ricardo's guest list included the biggest names in São Paulo's business world, journalists, and the most feared food critics. Lucia, dressed in an elegant chef's uniform that she had designed herself, felt butterflies in her stomach that reminded her of her first day in the penthouse. But now, it wasn't fear. It was the electricity of anticipation. Ricardo made sure she didn't stay hidden in the kitchen. She was the star, and she circulated through the dining room by his side, greeting the guests, his partner in every sense. The success was instant and thunderous. Every dish that came out of the kitchen was a work of art that told a story. The critics, initially skeptical, surrendered to the complexity and soul of the food. Whispers of admiration spread through the room. At the end of the night, with the restaurant still buzzing with energy, Ricardo raised a glass of champagne in a toast. "To Chef Lucia Oliveira," he said aloud for all to hear, "the woman who taught me the true taste of happiness." In that moment, under the applause, Lucia saw herself in the reflection of a window, no longer the invisible cleaner, but an acclaimed chef, master of her destiny and her success. The opening was just the beginning. In the days and weeks that followed, Helena and Sophia's became the epicenter of São Paulo's gastronomy scene. The reviews in newspapers and magazines were not just complimentary, they were true odes to Lucia's genius. The journalists, fascinated, were not content to just talk about the food, they wanted to tell the story. "The chef who turned pain into flavor," read one headline. "The Cinderella of the stove, from cleaning to stardom," announced another. Lucia's journey, her humble origins, her resilience, and her meteoric rise captured the public's imagination. She became a symbol of hope, Invitations for television shows and interviews began to pour in, and with the help of Ricardo, who acted as her safe harbor and main supporter, she learned to tell her own story, not with shame for her past, but with the pride of someone who had overcome every obstacle with dignity. Her voice, once silenced by fear, now inspired thousands of people across the country. The success of the restaurant brought new financial prosperity, but the true wealth they built was of a different nature. For Ricardo, the billions in his bank account had always been cold numbers, a way to measure his isolation from the world. His fortune now was the sound of Lucia's laughter echoing through the new house. It was sitting in the front row of Sophia's ballet performances. It was having a partner with whom he could discuss both a new dish and the direction of their lives. For Lucia, wealth was not in the restaurant's bank account, but in the peace of mind of knowing that her daughter would have all the opportunities she never had, in the freedom to create without limits, and in the security of a love that was, at the same time, passionate and profoundly serene. Their happiness was found in the simplest moments. On Sunday mornings, when the three of them would gather in the kitchen to make pancakes, with Ricardo covered in flour under the amused gaze of Lucia and Sophia. There, in that happy mess, was the empire they truly valued. A few years later, on a sunny Saturday, Ricardo made an unusual request. He wanted them to visit the old penthouse. Lucia felt a shiver, a phantom memory of the fear she felt in that place, but she agreed. As they stepped out of the private elevator and into the apartment, which was kept impeccably clean but uninhabited, the contrast with the life they now had was overwhelming. The silence was heavy, the air was cold, and the designer furniture looked like pieces from a museum of a life that was no longer theirs. Sophia, now almost 8 years old, looked around with her observant eyes and declared, "Our house is happier." Ricardo smiled, a genuine pain-free smile. He walked to the immense window with a view of the city and held Lucia's hand. "I needed to come back here with you," he said, "to thank this place. It was here that my pain allowed me to find you. It was here that life began again, even though I didn't know it." That apartment was no longer a mausoleum. It was just the prologue to their love story. The success and happiness they found overflowed from their lives and began to touch the lives of others. Lucia, who never forgot her origins, felt an immense need to give back the luck she had. Together, she and Ricardo made the most important decision of their lives after getting married. They created the Helena and Sophia Foundation, an organization with a dual and very clear mission. On one hand, to offer full scholarships to children from underprivileged communities who, like Sophia, possessed a brilliant potential waiting for an opportunity. On the other, to provide seed capital and mentorship for talented women in gastronomy who dreamed of opening their own small businesses but lacked the means to start. They were not just building a legacy. They were creating a chain of kindness, turning their unique love story into an engine of change for dozens and then hundreds of other people. Their happiness became a seed planted so that other gardens could flourish. Ricardo and Lucia's wedding was not a grand event for the society columns, but an intimate celebration of the life they had built. It took place on a late spring afternoon in the garden of their house, the place that symbolized the future they had chosen together. Under an arch of white flowers, with Sophia, now an eloquent and smiling preteen, as the proud maid of honor, they exchanged the vows they had written. Ricardo, with a choked voice, spoke of how Lucia and Sophia were the light that found him in the dark, who taught him to feel again and saved him from the prison of his own grief. Lucia, with tears of joy, spoke of how Ricardo saw her when she felt invisible, how he not only gave her security, but inspired her to find her own strength, proving that she was worthy not only of love, but also of admiration. There were no high society guests, only true friends, the restaurant staff who had become a second family, and the first young beneficiaries of the foundation. It was a party not of two worlds, coming together, but of a new world they had created. The years that passed solidified their happiness into a rich and vibrant tapestry. Ricardo, though still a major name in the tech world, found a much greater purpose. He delegated many of his duties in the company to dedicate himself body and soul to the foundation, finding more satisfaction in approving a new scholarship than in closing any billion-dollar contract. Lucia became an icon. Helena and Sophia's earned stars and international awards, and she published a cookbook that became a bestseller, not just for the food, but for the story of hope it contained in its pages. Sophia grew up to be an extraordinary young woman, with her father's intelligence and her mother's compassionate heart dividing her time between her advanced studies and volunteer work at the foundation that bore her name. They were living proof that the best things in life are not things, but encounters, and that even from the harshest winter, the most beautiful spring can be born. At the Foundation's annual event, a crowded ballroom gave a standing ovation as Lucia and Ricardo took the stage. They were no longer seen just as a power couple, but as the personification of hope. On the big screen, testimonials from young doctors, engineers, and artists, all former scholarship recipients, told how the opportunity they received changed the course of their lives. In one of the most emotional moments of the evening, Lucia handed the seed capital check to a young and talented cook from a peripheral community whose eyes shone with the same mix of fear and dream that Lucia had once felt. At the end of the ceremony, a little girl, the newest beneficiary of the scholarship program, shyly approached them and with trembling hands held out a cornstarch cookie bought with her savings. Ricardo knelt, accepted the cookie with the solemnity of one receiving a crown, and exchanged a look with Lucia that contained entire universes. The circle was complete. Kindness, once planted, was bearing fruit and spreading throughout the world. Later that night, back in the quiet, peaceful house, the true measure of their lives was evident. The restaurant's awards sat on a shelf, the magazine articles stored in boxes. What mattered was the now. Ricardo read in his armchair, no longer to escape, but for the pleasure of the story. Lucia, sitting on the sofa, scribbled ideas for a new seasonal menu, her face lit with a serene satisfaction. And at the piano, Sophia played a soft melody, the soundtrack of their home. They had learned the deepest lesson of all, that great transformations rarely begin with grand gestures. Their story did not begin with a millionaire rescue or an overwhelming passion. It began with the humble offering of a cornstarch cookie in a small, yellow-gloved hand. An act of pure and simple kindness that had the power to demolish walls, heal wounds, and build an empire, not of money, but of love. Looking back, it would be easy to call their story fate. 3 lonely souls, a man imprisoned by pain, a woman chained by hardship, and a child armed only with her innocence, whose paths crossed so improbably that it could only be the work of a higher power. But the truth was more complex and more beautiful. Fate only put them in the same place. It was their choices that wove the tapestry of their lives. Lucia's choice to be brave, Sophia's choice to be generous, Ricardo's choice to be vulnerable, and the daily choices that followed, to trust, to open up, to forgive the past, and above all, to love. Their happy ending was not a divine gift. It was an achievement, the reward for having had the bravery to find light in the darkest places and to build a future with the pieces of their broken hearts. And so, life went on, not like a fairy tale where there are no more sorrows, but like real life, with its challenges and its joys, now faced together. On any given night, much like so many others, Ricardo closed his book. Lucia put away her recipe notebook, and Sophia finished her melody at the piano. She approached her parents, and the 3 of them sat for a moment in silence on the sofa, just enjoying each other's presence. Ricardo took Lucia's hand, Sophia placed hers on top of theirs, and there, in that simple intertwining of fingers, lay the final truth of their journey. that a heart, no matter how deeply frozen, can learn to beat again. That dignity is a flame that no hardship can extinguish, and that a true family, is not a starting point, but the final destination we build day by day with the unbreakable bonds of love.